All right. You want me to start, Guy?
Sure.
All right, we are live. I want to welcome everybody this afternoon to a fiscal briefing with the two fiscal committees, Budget and Tax from the Senate and Appropriations from the House. This week, or actually, more correctly, the governor released his budget, and we have had a chance to review it internally. And today, this briefing is for the public to hear about the operating budget and the contents within it, so that we can begin both committees making our budget decisions. With that, I'll turn it over to the chairman of Budget and Tax, Guy Gazzoni, for any comments.
Everything you said was so right.
Well, there you
I
go.
don't have anything else to say.
All right, good. All right, well then I'm going to turn it over to David Romans, who is here with us to go through the document he has prepared. David.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to walk through the fiscal briefing that a lot of the budget staff at the Legislative Services have contributed to. I think I just would start out by saying that this is truly the best of times in state fiscal world. We entered the session before the governor submitted the budget with a $4 billion surplus in the current year on a cash basis. And as you know, from the end of last year, structural surplus is projected for the foreseeable future. So a really unusual and very favorable budget situation to start out in. And that allowed the governors, to sort of do three things in combination you don't see very often. You have tax relief, substantial spending increases, and billions of dollars being put into savings. And it's because of that great situation that we came into the session with that we're able to do that as a state. So I think the big question for you all as you work through the budget this session is what is the right balance among those three things? Did the governor get it right on the spending enhancements and initiatives? Are you comfortable with the tax relief proposals? Is the amount of savings he set aside correct? So I think as we walk through the document, I think those are the things you should try to keep in mind. We're going to go ahead and share a document on the screen to walk you through.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, so I don't know if we can make that a little bigger, but so we're going to start out with our quick look, which is kind of a really high level overview of the budget, and then subsequent speakers will take a little bit deeper dive into the details. So the first page here, the chart at the top just shows you the actual budget growth by fund. Overall, the budget actually drops $3.6 billion compared to fiscal 22, about a $58 billion spending plan. But that's because federal money was so inflated last year with all of the federal stimulus programs going on, and enhanced Medicaid match, enhanced funding for the SNAP program. So as those things start to dissipate, the federal funds drop off substantially, which is the reason the budget is going down. You can see federal funds drop almost 31%. The general funds, however, grow $4.6 billion or 22%. Now that includes an appropriation of $2.4 billion to the rainy day fund. When you take that out, the budget's really growing outside of savings by about 13%. The governor's budget leaves a general fund balance at the end of fiscal 23 of almost $600 million and a rainy day fund balance of $3.6 billion, which is almost 16% of general fund revenues. That is the highest level in the rainy day fund that anyone can recall. So combined, we have about $4.2 billion of cash in the bank under the governor's plan. We've talked a little bit about the federal funds backfill. I think we can go to the next page, actually. So, one of the key elements of the governor's plan is his tax relief, and it's outlined there in the chart in the middle of the page. There's three elements. The first is phasing out income tax on retirement income, starting in fiscal 23. Does not fully phase in until fiscal 28. So about 188 million of revenue losses in 23 to the general fund, growing to 730 in 27, and even a larger number in fiscal 28. Business filing fees. If you're an online filer, you won't have to pay a filing fee anymore under the governor's proposal. And you can see that reduces revenues by a relatively modest amount each year. And then extending the earned income tax credit enhancements. So these were enhancements that you included in the Relief Act last year, and you had them effective for tax years 2020 through tax year 2022. The governor would extend those on an ongoing basis. So it doesn't actually have any fiscal impact in 23 as it's already law for fiscal 23. But after that, it'll be about $160 million a year of revenue losses. It is worth noting that the other tax relief you provided last session was for those individuals who don't have a social security number. The governor's plan to extend your tax actions does not include that group. That tax relief was in about the $65–67 million range if you were to tack that on. All right, so let's go forward to the next page. So what does this all mean in terms of the structural budget outlook? So there's a lot going on in this chart. So let's start with the black solid line. That is the governor's structural budget forecast before the tax relief. So if you don't do anything else, you just accept his budget and didn't do any of the tax relief, those are the estimated structural surpluses you would have under the governor's proposal. And then the blue bars below are after you take into account the tax relief. Obviously, it reduces ongoing revenues. But under his counting, we still would have a structural surplus in the $200 to $300 million range a year through fiscal 27. Now, Legislative Services has done kind of a pro forma look at the governor's forecast, and we differ a little bit in those out years. There's two reasons we differ. The first is that we actually think they've overstated Medicaid costs a little bit. And that's part of why you see in fiscal 26, we think the structural gap is a little better in the cash under both scenarios. And then for fiscal 27, we think it's a lot worse. And that's because throughout the period, we think the K through 12 education estimates are low. And we can't really tell you why, because the administration has not been willing to share the assumptions they use for their K through 12 forecast. But we think it's a little bit low using our enrollment estimates and other factors. And as a result, eventually that means that we will need additional general funds to support the program. And then we would project a structural deficit in 27 under the governor's proposal of about $400 million. I would caution that I think that when we forecast out the fiscal 28 a little bit later in session, that it'll get worse for two reasons. One, the Kerwin costs continue to grow in fiscal 28. And two, because that's the final year of the phase-in of the tax proposal on retirement income. So there'll be more revenue losses in 28 and more general fund support for Kerwin implementation. So it's likely to be a little bit larger. So in our view, it's the governor's plan is a little bit rosy in terms of its accounting. And let's go to the next slide. All right, so the other thing that we wanted to kind of show you, on chart, I guess, is what happened with that surplus. As I mentioned at the start, $4 billion coming into the session in the current year. So what did the governor do? Well, a lot of it went into savings. He put $2.4 billion into the rainy day fund. He was required to do that, but he chose not to take any of it out. He's probably about $315 million has dropped to the general fund bottom line. There's a number of spending adjustments to fiscal 22 that net out to about $229 million of net additional spending, with the biggest single item being additional funds for employee compensation for the COLAs and increments the governor has announced for this month. There's some one-time spending in fiscal 23, including addressing some unfunded liabilities, repayment of program open space, and so forth. And then the big chunk of additional spending is there's $910 million of pay-go in fiscal 23, supplementing the general obligation bond proposal. So that's sort of where the $4 billion goes, more than half to savings, and then the next big chunk into one-time pay-go. So for the most part, the governor seems to have spent the money on one-time things that he didn't use to put into savings. All right, starting in the lower part of page 4, we get into sort of other key features in the budget. Education aid is up about $260 million or 3.5%. The Kerwin formulas are generally funded. However, the governor did not fund the education effort adjustment component of Kerwin, which would have provided money to Baltimore City and Prince George's County in fiscal 23. And we'll talk about that more later on. In the healthcare arena, there were mandated healthcare increases for most providers of the Medicaid program, as well as behavioral health and developmental disabilities. Those are all funded generally between 3.25% increases and 4%, again, consistent with the mandates in law. Governors also increased funding for physician fees and for dental fees in the Medicaid program. There's quite a bit of money in the budget for crime prevention and victim services, most notably about almost 50 million of new money for the police aid formula. The budget also allocates quite a bit of money for childcare. There's a deficiency appropriation of $50 million to help stabilize the childcare provider community. And then there's about 10 million of growth in the fiscal 23 budget for the childcare scholarship program to help support more scholarships for low-income children. There's also more than $100 million in this budget to address cybersecurity needs. And we can go on to the next slide. I'd say a couple other little sort of highlights here. There's a lot of money in higher education. The university system gets a 19% increase, almost $300 million. About 40% of that growth is for employee salaries and increments. And similarly, Morgan State receives about a 28% increase to 33 million. And St. Mary's also sees a healthy growth in their formula. And because the community college formulas and the Selinger formula for the private institutions sort of ride along on what the aid for FTE is at the public four-year institutions, they also see dramatic increases. Community colleges receiving an additional 59 million, and the Selinger schools receiving almost 30 million of new money. There's between fiscal 22 and 23, there's 832 million for employee salary enhancements. That's a combination of bonuses, increments, and COLAs. We'll talk about that all more later on. Touching on the capital budget for a minute, the governor proposed a GO bond limit of 1.165 million. That's 265 million more than the Capital Debt Affordability Committee had recommended this past fall. The governor supplemented that with about over 900 million of PAYGO and 210 million of bond premium. So a capital program that's well over $2 billion this year. The governor also reserved 50 million for legislative priorities. That is quite a bit less than was the target from the Spending Affordability Committee this fall. And there's about $1 billion in funding for school construction if you include the Built to Learn programs, about 502 million, or 520 million, excuse me, from GO and cash, and the rest is from Built to Learn. All right, so let's go on there at the bottom to the potential legislative issues, sort of the things we think you'll be thinking about this session. The first is consideration of the governor's tax proposals, clearly. Second is, what is the right level of reserves to maintain? When the Spending Affordability Committee recommended 9% in the rainy day fund, the governor's at 16%. His general fund balance is also quite a bit larger than the Spending Affordability Committee goal. If we do remain as a state at a really elevated level in the rainy day fund, you may want to create some criteria in statute for when the funds should be withdrawn, because there's not a whole lot of criteria in statute currently. Let's go to the next slide. All right, I alluded to this earlier. There's underfunding of Kerwin. So there's a formula for the education effort adjustment that should have allocated $126 million, 99 million going to Baltimore City, 26.5 going to Prince George's County. As I mentioned, that is not in the budget. There is a dispute as to whether that is actually a mandate for this year. Our understanding was it was a mandate. The administration is asserting it is not, and the Attorney General's office is reviewing that. There's also a number of smaller non-mandated Kerwin programs that were in statute, and you can see them outlined in that chart that the governor elected not to put money into the budget for, the largest piece being training for leaders and teachers. As you can see, a variety of other initiatives that are likely important to various groups. Moving on from Kerwin, the other issue to keep in mind is federal infrastructure funding is not in the budget. We expect Maryland's going to receive about $2.8 billion in sort of enhanced infrastructure funding as a result of the congressional action. And again, it's not in the budget. There's still a lot of information lacking from the federal agencies about exactly how much Maryland will get and what the criteria for using it are. So I think reviewing with the various agencies how they're going to allocate that money, I think would be something the budget committees will want to spend some time on. Evaluating whether you're comfortable with only 50 million for legislative priorities, or if you want to try to move closer to the spending affordability target of 300 million in the capital budget. The long-term sustainability of the blueprint fund. As I mentioned, it will run out of money certainly by fiscal 27, if not a little bit sooner under the governor's accounting. And after that, there'll need to be a general fund supplement each year on top of the annual revenues going into the blueprint fund. Other couple of issues to mention. The federal government has extended the disaster relief or emergency national healthcare emergency declaration. And what that means for the state is we get another 3 months of enhanced Medicaid match. This happened after the budget had been put together. So there's essentially 100 million of surplus general funds in the budget for Medicaid because we will now be getting federal funds to cover those costs. And finally, an issue that certainly Appropriations has already spent some time on this session, state hiring and retention. As I mentioned, there's a lot of money in the budget for salary enhancements. The question is whether that is enough in the current employment environment to help fill many of the state vacancies, and whether there's other sort of creative strategies that the state needs to think about employing. So in a real short nutshell, that is sort of our a targeted overview of the budget. I'm going to turn it over in a minute to Teresa Jasinski. We'll get into revenues, and then the rest of our team will go through some other topics. But happy to answer any questions on the big picture if you want now, or we can just move along.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for David? I see none on my side. Okay, very good.
Okay, well then we'll move on to Teresa, who will talk to you about the revenue outlook.
Thank you very much. We're going to actually start with the economy on this page 7 here. What you see on the chart in front of you are the performance of some key metrics for the Maryland economy in calendar 2021 by month. And we'll start with the labor market, the first couple of columns. The first column is the year-over-year percent change in employment. So the January number, for example, is a 6% decline. So that's January 2021 compared to January 2020. And you'll notice those first 3 months are all down. That's the first quarter. And that's because it's comparing to a period in 2020 before the pandemic had even really started. And then the next couple months, April, May, June, you see very, very strong growth. And again, in 2020, what was happening was the very first months of the pandemic, which was really the most severe economic impact of the pandemic recession. So it's a good reminder that year-over-year percent changes sometimes tell you more about the prior year rather than the current year. The second column is simply the total number of jobs in the state relative to the pre-pandemic peak, which was in January of 2020. Between January and April of 2020, the state lost about 400,000 jobs. It's about a little over 14%. And as of November of 2021, the latest data we have, it's still down a little less than 85,000 jobs. It's a little over 3%. Of course, one of the sectors that was most hard hit by the pandemic was the industry that includes hotels and motels, restaurants and bars. That sector lost about half their jobs between January and April of 2020, around 122,000. And as of November of 2021, they were still down a little less than 40,000 jobs. So they account for a little bit less than half of the current job gap of 85,000. We also see a job gap relative to the pre-pandemic level in the healthcare and social assistance industry sector, about 13,000 jobs or 3.5%. This includes everything you would associate with healthcare along with nursing homes and things like childcare providers. But there are some sectors that are actually higher now than they were pre-pandemic. The biggest percentage-wise at 7.5% or about 8,200 jobs is the transportation and utilities sector. And what this includes is warehousing and courier and delivery services. So it's kind of not surprising given the sharp increase in online sales. The federal government is also up relative to January of 2020, about 6,300 jobs or 4.3%. The federal government was the only sector of the economy where employment did not fall during the pandemic recession. And also the other big category that's up is the professional services category, up about 11,000 jobs from January of 2020, a little less than 4%. This includes a wide variety of professional business services, whether it's legal, accounting, architects, as well as management consulting, research and development, computer services. There are a lot of federal contractors in this sector. And those two sectors, the federal government and professional services, they're some of the highest paying sectors of the economy in Maryland. And that feeds into strong wage growth. And in the middle of the chart, you can see wage growth. Wage data is only available quarterly, which is why you only see numbers for every 3 months. So March is the first quarter, June is the second quarter, September is the third quarter, which is the latest available data. Some of the strong growth you see, especially that second quarter number at 10.9%. Again, it's really more about what was happening in 2020. The second quarter of 2020, aggregate wages actually fell 2.4%. But it's also the growth, the overall year to date, it's up 8.4. It's being helped along by both job growth and growth in those particularly high paying sectors. But as we all know, inflation has been elevated. And so the next column shows you what happens if you adjust for inflation. So it comes down quite a bit, but it's still positive in the low single digits. And if you're interested, below this table is a little table that shows you the forecast of the US Consumer Price Index from two private economic forecasting companies that the state contracts with, Moody's Analytics and IHS Markit. They're both forecasting 4 to 5% inflation again in 2022, and then it drops down to a little over 2%, basically in line with the inflation targets of the Federal Reserve, as the Federal Reserve is going to start tightening monetary policy over the next year or two. And the other big story in the economy is the housing market. The last two columns on this chart are the year-over-year percent change in existing home sales and the median home price. This is data from the Maryland Association of Realtors. In the first half of 2021, you see very strong sales growth, very strong price growth. Again, you're comparing to the period in 2020 when sales really fell sharply at the beginning of the pandemic. But in 2020, in the second half of the year, home sales were actually very strong. And for the year as a whole, they were up 9.3%. So you'll see in the second half of 2021 that home sales have actually started to fall on a year-over-year basis. Although I will say they are well above 2019 levels because mortgage rates remain much lower than they were pre-pandemic. Given that strong demand, it's not surprising to see pretty substantial appreciations in home prices. Home prices have continued to rise, even though sales have started to fall. And that's in part due to extremely low inventory of homes for sale. If we move on to the next chart, we'll talk about the general fund revenue forecast. In December, the Board of Revenue Estimates, the BRE, put out a new revenue forecast. And this table on page 8 compares it to their previous forecast from September. Overall, general fund revenues were revised up by $495 million in fiscal 2022. That's about a 2.3% upward revision. In fiscal 23, it's $543 million. That's about a 2.4% upward revision. And almost all of the upward revision came from the personal income tax and the sales and use tax. Between September and December, the BRE did revise up their estimate of economic growth in terms of total personal income growth in both 21 and 22, as well as an upward revision to their wage forecast. Keep in mind that the economic forecast that underlies the December estimate was done in mid-November. So it's not only pre the Omicron wave, it's before anybody had even heard of Omicron. So just keep that in mind. But that being said, that stronger wage growth that we've seen, as well as their forecasts, did feed into an upward revision in personal income tax withholding. The income tax is by far the biggest revenue source, and withholding is by far the biggest portion of the income tax. Also, since September, we got past the final due date for tax year 2020 returns, and final payments with returns came in higher than expected. There also was a technical factor that had a significant impact on the income tax. In September, the BRE had overestimated refunds. They had double counted about $240 million of refunds that had been paid out year to date for tax year 20. If you overestimate refunds, you underestimate the general fund. That error was corrected in the December forecast, and that contributed to the upward revision as well. The sales tax was revised upward, both reflecting the revised economic forecast, but also really strong year-to-date revenues. But there is also an issue with the blueprint that's worth pointing out, and it's highlighted at the bottom of this, the table on this page. As you recall, the sales tax from certain sources are shared with the blueprint. There's 3 categories. There are revenues from remote sellers who were required to collect the tax after the Supreme Court's Wayfair decision. There's revenues collected for marketplace facilitators on third-party sales. That was required by legislation at the 2019 session. Those two categories together, the first 100 million goes to the general fund, the rest goes to the blueprint. And the final category is revenue from digital goods sales. That was legislation from the 2020 session. That bill was vetoed. The veto was overridden at the 2021 session. I should say that identifying those particular categories of sales tax revenues is not easy. It's not a straightforward process. It doesn't just come out of the Comptroller's Office processing system. Although they ask companies to report whether they belong in one of those categories, the BRE has found out that they cannot rely on the self-reporting. And so it's a very manual process of going through tax returns to come up with how much revenue should be shared with the blueprint. As a result of the fact that they did not have full access to the sales tax returns, at the fiscal 2021 closeout, the Comptroller's Office was aware that they had underdistributed to the blueprint in fiscal 2021. At the time of the September estimate, they projected this to be about $88 million. And the Comptroller's Office is planning to make an extra distribution to the blueprint in fiscal 22 to compensate for that underdistribution in fiscal 21. If they underdistribute to the blueprint, that means they overdistributed to the general fund. And the September estimate from the BRE reflected this expected distribution of 88 million. Subsequent to the September estimate, they had full access to all the sales tax returns. They could go through everything, and they determined that the underdistribution was less than expected. It was $49 million. And so that change is now reflected in the December 2021 estimate for the sales tax for the general fund and the sales tax for the blueprint. And it also had the impact of changing baseline revenues for the general fund and the blueprint. So it had an effect in 22, but it also had an effect in the out years and contributed to the upward revision of the general fund revenue forecast in the out years. And that's kind of all I have on the revenues and the economies, but I would be happy to take any questions.
If there are no questions, we'd move on to a more detailed discussion of the operating budget with Rebecca Ruff and Tanya Zimmerman.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. So on this page, what you have is just a reiteration of the summary that Dave provided with regard to where the general fund and also the rainy day fund are projected to end in terms of both cash and structural balances for fiscal 21 through 23. Because of better than anticipated revenues and closeout at the end of fiscal 21, you can see here that the state had in excess of $3 billion in cash at the end of fiscal 21 and is projected to end with a similar posture or greater posture at the end of fiscal 2022. In addition, we're projecting structural balances in excess of $1 billion for both of those years. The significant performance at the end of fiscal 21 did trigger a sizable appropriation required through the sweeper provision to the rainy day fund. And so fiscal 2023 is projected that in addition to the governor's spending, his budget projects a closing balance of about $584 million at the end of fiscal 2023 and a structural balance of about $289 million. All told, the state will have about $4.2 billion in cash available at the end of fiscal 2023. If we account for the traditional 5% balance that's maintained in the rainy day fund, this leaves us with about $3.1 billion in cash. But as the next page shows you, because the governor chose to appropriate the entire amount of the sweeper and not redirect any portion of it for spending elsewhere, the rainy day fund is at a closing balance of about 15.7% of general fund revenues in fiscal 2023, which you can see from this chart is the highest point that we've ever been, going as far back as 1998, with a closing balance of just under $3.6 billion. This is well above both the 5% that we typically try to maintain and also well above the 9% that was recommended by the Spending Affordability Committee.
Good afternoon. So this begins the discussion of items in the fiscal 2023 budget. So the first couple charts are related to deficiency appropriations that are included in the budget, as well as contingent reductions for fiscal 2023 spending in the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. So in total, deficiency appropriations would add $4.2 billion to the fiscal 2022 budget. 2.9 billion of that is for additional SNAP benefits and the PEBT benefits that go to children and childcare who experienced reduced hours or couldn't get free meals at school because they were closed. Portion of that is payments that were for last school year due to the timing of the distribution. The payments continued into fiscal 2023. The next biggest portion, about $500 million, are for other entitlements. Most of this is in the Medicaid and behavioral health areas, and that includes the extra quarter of enhanced FMAP that is not the additional quarter that we learned about after kind of the budget was put together, but is for the quarter that ends in March, as well as funding for provider rate increases related to home and community-based services that were an additional enhancement. And it also includes a one-time kind of deficiency for behavioral health providers that relate to fiscal 2021 bills that were carried into fiscal 2022. There's just under $400 million of deficiencies related to statewide personnel, which include the bonuses and the COLAs and the merit increases, as well as some health insurance deficiencies. The other area that I'd like to highlight here is the stimulus fund area. There's about $620 million of additional stimulus, kind of exclusive of things that are kind of in other categories. But there are offsetting general fund reductions of $350 million and federal funds of $50 million. $350 million of that 620 are related to kind of just those general fund swaps. 250 million is related to some of the plans that were from last session when they could not refund the recovery initiative from the fall of 2020. Additional stimulus funds include about $87 million in the energy assistance area, which includes water assistance. You go to the next slide. This is just the general fund portion of the deficiencies, which net to about $263 million. There's a $500 million reduction. Again, that's related to the additional quarter of the enhanced FMAP and the stimulus fund swaps, as well as a smaller fund swap of about $45 million in the higher education investment fund due to available fund balance and higher revenue. There are $264 million related to those statewide personnel actions. And then entitlements, excluding the FMAP, are about $193 million. And again, the largest portion of that is for that fiscal 2021 payment, fiscal 2021 bills related to behavioral health. If you go to the next slide. So this chart shows the percentage of kind of each of those categories that their budgets in fiscal 2023 that are made up of general, special, and federal funds. And then it also in the line shows the kind of year over year change in the budget from fiscal 2022 to 2023. And as you can see in the higher general funded agencies, the budget increase. And then you start getting into some decreases where there are kind of larger portions of federal funds. Kind of the three largest areas of decrease are really driven by kind of stimulus related funding or funding kind of associated with the pandemic. And that includes in the other entitlements area, which is largely driven by returning a lower anticipated caseload and benefits for the SNAP program and the end of the PEBT program. The other education, which is really driven by the stimulus funds related to childcare, and other executive agencies, which are driven by stimulus funds in the Department of Housing and Community Development and the repayment of the Unemployment Trust Fund. If you go to the next page. So this chart provides the information, a summary of the total general fund growth in the budget, which is 4.6 billion. The largest portion of that is related to the reserve fund. As Rebecca mentioned, there was a significant requirement due to this for the sweeper for the rainy day fund, and that's partially offset by some one-time spending in the dedicated purpose account. The next largest area is kind of state agency operations, and we'll get into a little more detail on the next slide. But the next largest portion then is entitlements, and that is primarily driven by backfilling the enhanced FMAP. So Medicaid increases by about $465 million. So they're the largest portion of that increase. If you go to the next page. So this gets into a little more detail on the general fund increase for state agencies, which totals $1.3 billion. 421 million of that is in the area of personnel, which includes over $260 million of increases related to statewide employee compensation, including the COLAs, the annualization of fiscal 2022 COLAs, as well as merit increases. And then the kind of backfilling of the stimulus funds are kind of an additional 350 million. After that, the next highest is in the higher education arena, which includes increases of about 180 million for the University System of Maryland and Morgan State, as well as increases related to Selinger due to the kind of increases within the funding at USM and Morgan State. You can go to the next slide, and Rebecca will cover the next area.
So this page is one that we used to include in fiscal briefings, but haven't seen in a while. What it does is it compares what is included in the governor's allowance to what we anticipated or projected in our DLS baseline estimate that was presented to you all in the fall. And it's helpful, especially in a year where we have a lot of additional spending, because it highlights some of the unanticipated enhancements. And as you can see from the bottom of this list, a few shortfalls to help us explain what discretionary decisions the governor may have made in terms of where to allocate funds in the budget. And so we've identified just under $2 billion in spending differences between our baseline estimate and what is included in the allowance. The largest pot being PAYGO funds, which Matt will talk to you about in a little bit more detail later. And also the second largest pot being employee compensation, which we have some additional charts on as well. Other than that, there's significant funding provided for cybersecurity assessments in the dedicated purpose account. So that will likely be spent over multiple years. There's a backfill for prior BPW reduction back when we thought the state's fiscal situation was more dire. Higher education institutions received a funding reduction. So there's increased funds provided to help account for that in the budget. There's also $60 million provided for enhanced childcare and a few other or quite a few other items here on this list that will be discussed as in the budget analyses as you hear them in the hearings. To turn now to focus more on a few highlighted topics of interest, we thought we would start on the next page with providing you a little bit of information about public safety enhancements in the budget. You may have heard that the governor announced $500 million in funding for his Refund the Police initiative. So on the top half of this page is the summary, according to the administration, of what's included in that $500 million. It's worth noting that only about 30% of that $500 million, or about $155 million, is provided in the current budget before you. The biggest enhancement here is additional funds provided through the State Aid for Police Protection Grant in the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth, and Victim Services. There's an additional $45 million provided in fiscal 2023, with the majority of that enhancement going to the largest counties, and also funding added into that program for Baltimore City, which hadn't previously received funds through that program. The initiative includes the compensation enhancements for participants in the FOP and SLEOLA labor unions. And then the funding for police scholarships and accountability resources, which is largely for equipment and training and body cameras. That $18 million is provided in response to the requirements established through the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021. With regard to the funding provided for victim services, I would just note, on the page that we were on, that there's about $20 million in federal funds that's used to make VOCA providers whole in fiscal 2022, and the remainder of additional funds identified for victim services through this initiative is $6 million in general funds each year provided for the programs listed in the bullets in the middle of the page. Beyond what the governor is including in his Refund the Police initiative, there's also additional public safety enhancements provided in the budget to increase funding for justice reinvestment grants, to provide about $4.7 million for the Violence Intervention and Prevention Fund. There's also a total of $3.5 million provided for rape kit testing grants. And the governor has increased the Protection Against Hate Crimes grants to $5 million. It had previously been funded at the $3 million level. On the next page, as David mentioned at in his presentation, there is currently no funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in the budget, although we are hearing from some agencies like MDOT that there is a strong potential that we will see funds brought in through a supplemental budget later on in session. But in total, as he said, there's about $8.2 billion that we have identified as expected to come to Maryland over the next 5 years. About 84% of that funding is expected to go to the transportation sector. I would note that in the $1.1 billion in funding provided for water, that this does include $238 million anticipated for the Chesapeake Bay, all of which may not come directly to Maryland, but Maryland is directly impacted by improvements to the Bay. The bottom half of this page highlights the $2.8 billion funding, these beyond appropriations. And as you can see, about 55% of that new funding is expected to go to transportation, and all of the $1.1 billion in funding we've identified for water-related programs is actually new or enhanced funding. There's also small pots for cybersecurity and broadband as well.
So we're moving on now to personnel, and Jason Kramer is going to talk about a couple of issues there.
Sure, thanks, Dave. For those of you in appropriations, you already saw this chart last week, but for everyone else, this shows the vacancies by department in the executive branch. As you can see in the bottom, in the middle, January vacancies, there are nearly 6,100 vacancies in the executive branch. That's the most since at least 2008. The budgeted turnover rate that the agencies have set across the executive department is at about 6.7%. So there are more than twice as many vacancies as would be necessary to meet the budgeted turnover rate. In the past, I would point out some outliers among some of the state departments, but for the most part, every state agency, every state department has between 10 and 14% vacancy rate. And we can move on to the next slide and discuss what has been alluded to before in this presentation. One of the responses to this vacancy rate issues is the addition of significant salary actions to the state budget for both fiscal 22 and fiscal 23. This chart breaks down the actions by bargaining unit. AFSCME is receiving a $1,000 bonus and a 2% COLA and an increment this month, as well as a 3% COLA and an increment in July. AFT, MPEC, and non-represented employees are getting a $1,500 bonus and a 1% COLA and increment this month, and a 3% COLA and increment in July. And then SLEOLA is getting a 7% COLA and increment in July of this year. And that totals about $830 million allocated for these purposes in the current budget.
All right, so we're going to jump ahead into local aid next with Hiram Birch, who's our local aid expert, who's going to walk you through a few charts to kind of give you the big picture there.
Okay, as you can see on page 21, state aid to local governments will total $9.2 billion. This represents a $383 million increase from the prior year, which is a 4.3% increase. Public schools continue to receive the vast majority of state aid, with state funding totaling around $7.8 billion. This represents a $260 million increase over the prior year. Funding for county and municipal governments will total around $841 million. This represents a $61 million increase. This funding increase does include the governor's proposed enhancement for police aid and police accountability. Community college funding is set at $430 million, which is a $58 million increase. Libraries will receive around $88 million, and local health departments will receive around $75 million. We turn to page 22, it shows the funding for some of the major programs. Education aid under the major formula programs mostly increased in FY23, following decreases in fiscal 2022 due to the significant student enrollment declines resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the governor's veto of the blueprint legislation. The General Assembly intended for funding of the blueprint to begin in fiscal 22. Because of the governor's veto and the subsequent veto override during the 21 session, the first year of blueprint implementation and phasing in of the funding increases was skipped. As you can see for fiscal 23, the increase in foundation funding is more dramatic than it would otherwise have been, since FY22 plan increases were not funded. In addition, those several blueprint funding programs that were funded in fiscal 20 and 21 are not funded in 23. The education funding formulas for FY23 incorporates funding amounts as enhancements to existing formulas. Looking at the compensatory aid program, it's important to note that the funding includes a $57.3 million hold harmless grant to offset the relatively high decrease in the free and reduced price meal count. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, the free and reduced price meal count has decreased by around 13% over a 2-year period. In 6 jurisdictions, the decrease has exceeded over 20%. In contrast, if you look at the English language learners program, additional funding there is due to both the increase in the per pupil foundation amount and a sizable increase in student enrollment, which increases by 11% this year. It results in around 10,000 additional students receiving language services. And this increase is occurring throughout the state. Only 2 local school systems are reflecting a decrease in their English language learners for this year. The student transportation is up by around $48 million, and this is due to the return of in-person instruction of special education students and a relatively high inflation rate. In fact, the inflation adjustment this year is capped at the 8% level. It should be noted that 2 programs that were funded in FY 2022 discontinued this year. That is $212 million in one-time COVID relief payments and $209 million in hold harmless grants. Turning to community colleges, you can see that funding is up by around $59 million, which is a 20.5% increase. This is due to the relatively high increase in state funding at the 4-year institutions of higher education. Funding per student increases by 27.2%. Student enrollment is actually decreasing by 9.3%, resulted in 7,500 fewer students. Funding for the local health grants increases by around $1 million, and this is due primarily to growth in inflation and population. If we look at the county and municipal level, the growth in local transportation funding is due to the increase in transportation trust fund revenues. As stated earlier, the additional public safety grants is due to the governor's initiative to enhance police aid by providing around $46 million in grants based on both county population and the municipal sworn officer count. In addition, the state budget includes $8 million for police accountability measures. One program that is decreasing in the county municipal area is disparity grant. That is down by $12.4 million this year, and that is due to three primary factors. One is the higher local income wealth in Baltimore City. The second factor is a lower tax effort in Washington County, and also the updated population counts in the 2020 census is also affecting the program. Specifically, Baltimore City will realize $11.3 million increase in funding under the program. This is due to the narrowing of the disparities in income wealth in Baltimore City compared to other jurisdictions. Over the past 12 years, Baltimore City has led the state in the average annual increase in the per capita income tax yield, which is the main component of the disparity grant program. In Washington County's case, the jurisdiction reduced their income tax rate in tax year 2022 from 3.2% to 3%. And this consequently reduces the minimum funding level provided under the program. This results in a $3.4 million decrease in disparity grants in Washington County. If we turn to page 23, it shows state aid amounts on a per capita basis and as a percent change basis. State aid per capita averages around $1,500, ranges from $785 in Talbot County to over $2,500 in Caroline County. This represents the state policy to provide greater financial assistance to local governments that have a lower tax base. And in fact, around 70% of state aid is allocated based on local wealth, which includes the local property tax base and the local income tax base. The annual increase in state aid averages around 4.3%. The annual percent change exceeds 8% in 5 counties, while the increase is below 2% in 3 counties. If you turn to page 24, it kind of shows the impact of the one-time COVID relief payments on direct education aid. Around $211.6 million in COVID relief was provided last year to local school systems. Since these funds are no longer included in the FY23 budget, you can see that the difference between FY22 and FY23 is only around 4.7%. In 2 jurisdictions, Baltimore City and Garrett County, they are actually realizing a decrease in funding this year. When you adjust for the COVID relief and take it out of the FY22 base, overall funding for public schools is around 8%, and funding in Prince George's will go up to 2.9%, and Garrett County's funding will go up by 2.2%. Another program that's really impacting Prince George's County this year is the elimination of the hold harmless grants that was provided last year to offset decreases in student enrollment. Prince George's County was one of the primary beneficiaries of that one-time grant. They actually received around 39% of the funding. So that is also impacting Prince George's growth in education aid this year. The next page shows the net effect on direct education aid by the governor's underfunding of the mandates under the Blueprint program. You can see around $125.5 million is what was supposed to be provided under the Education Effort Index, with Baltimore City receiving $99 million and Prince George's receiving $26.5 million. In lieu of providing these funds, the governor did provide additional funds for compensatory education as hold harmless, and also additional funds for 4-day pre-kindergarten that was not required under the Blueprint legislation. You can see the net result is still around $161,000 decrease. However, you can see that Prince George's and Baltimore City are the 2 jurisdictions mostly impacted by this. And finally, if you turn to page 26, It just gives you some information on K through 12 enrollment trends. And as you can see there, over the last 2 years, the FTE enrollment has decreased by 3% statewide. Only one school system, Frederick, is realizing an increase in their FTE enrollment over the 2-year period with a strong 4% increase. When you look at the free and reduced price meal count, the enrollment over the 2-year period is down by 13%. In 6 school systems, the decrease exceeds over 20%. And only 2 school systems, Caroline and Worcester, are showing an increase in their free and reduced price meal count.
Okay, and then we're going to move on to transportation and Steve McCulloch.
Okay, on this page, we show a comparison of the Transportation Trust Fund 6-year forecast that came out last week. That's the 3rd column of numbers. The first column of numbers is the Transportation Trust Fund forecast that came out last year. In both instances, the change columns represent comparisons to the 2020 forecast, which was pre-pandemic. And as you can see from the 2nd and 4th columns, last year's forecast, we were, reflecting a nearly $1.7 billion write-down in revenues and corresponding decrease in expenditures relative to the 2020 forecast. But the current forecast that was issued last week is actually showing a net total revenue of $505 million increase compared to 2020. The improvement has not been uniform. As you can see under the top section of the table, taxes and fees, motor fuel taxes are still down in the current forecast relative to 2020 by $169 million. However, titling tax, is really taken off at $448 million increase. Corporate income likewise has a large increase. Under the other revenues, operating revenues continue to be down in the current forecast, very similar to what we saw last year. And this reflects the fact that many of the passenger revenues for the transit system are still down, with transit ridership being not returning to pre-pandemic levels. You'll also notice in that other revenue section that the bonds that are being issued over the 6-year period are down $552 million compared to 2020 6-year forecast. This reflects the approaching of the minimum acceptable debt service coverage ratios, and therefore the amount of debt that will be issued is down. And in fact, in 2023, MDOT does not expect to, or is not planning to issue any transportation bonds for that year. The current forecast does benefit from federal COVID stimulus funding that was not shown in last year's in the amounts that we now know. So this current forecast has $888 million compared to only $148 million that was shown last year. And of course, that all then trickles down onto the spending side. Again, $505 million increase in the current forecast compared to the 2020, with the capital program benefiting to the tune of $939 million. Of course, keep in mind that absent that federal stimulus, that increase in capital would nearly disappear. The operating budget spending still shows a $415 million decrease in the current forecast compared to the 2020. That is reflecting, however, the delay in the opening of the Purple Line and the consequent delay in the beginning of availability payments that MTA will be making for that service. So that explains why overall operating budgets are down. There are many areas of increase in other areas of the budget. Next page, please. So now we start looking at the capital program. This chart compares fiscal 2023, comparing the Capital Transportation Program, or CTP, that came out last Wednesday, with last January 2021 levels by mode. And as you can see, the total increase is about $762 million in fiscal 2023 compared to what was showing for fiscal 2023 last year. And MTA, or Transit Administration, by far the largest dollar increase, 75% increase on a percentage basis. 1/3 of that increase is related to the Purple Line spending. So there's a lot of, there've been a lot of changes with the now replacement design build contractor that has been identified. The Department of Transportation has now updated all of the information related to that in the CTP. Next slide, please. This is the same type of comparison. Again, still looking at CTP, but this is the full 6-year spending for this CTP versus 1 year ago. And it's still very much the same type of percentage increases. Again, for the Maryland Transit Administration, the Purple Line spending accounts for about 1/3 of that. But there are a number of other kind of large projects that have been moved in, including zero emission bus procurement, adds $200 million to the 6-year program. The Eastern Bus Facility has been added, and that adds another about $200 million to the CTP that was not in last year's CTP at all. And we'll be discussing each of these administrations in the individual budget analysis that you'll be hearing soon. And that completes for me.
So last but not least, Matthew Klein is going to give you a kind of a very quick overview of capital.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon. So beginning on page 30, this compares the governor's fiscal 2023 proposed capital budget to the current fiscal 2022 budget. You can see that including transportation through the CTP, as well as including the Maryland Stadium Authority Built to Learn bonds, the total capital program is a little bit under $6.2 billion at $6.175 billion for fiscal 2023. And this compares to about $6.26 billion for fiscal 2022. So about an $82 million decrease. However, if you control for the substantial reduction in the CTP that Steve just talked about, and changes in the estimates for the amount of Built to Learn bonds that would be issued in fiscal 2023 compared to what has been proposed to be issued in fiscal 2022, the capital program comes in at about $3.3 billion compared to about $2.5 in the current fiscal year. So a little bit under $800 million increase over the current fiscal 2022 budget. For general obligation bond funds, the governor has proposed a $1.65 billion of new GO bond issuances, plus an additional $40 million of recycled bonds from deauthorizations. The governor chose to take the recommendation from SAC from 2020, which was built into the 2021 session CIP, which was $1.15 billion, plus added an additional $50 million for inflation, which is pretty significant in the construction market. As David had said earlier, this is, however, $265 million more than what the Capital Debt Affordability Committee had proposed at the $900 million level, when there was suggestion that significant infusion of general funds would be available to support the capital program. The budget continues the use of bond premiums in fiscal 2023, $210 million, slightly less than what was included in the fiscal 2022 budget, but basically pretty level funded. In general funds, again, this is where the significant increase in the governor's capital program relative to fiscal 2022 comes into place. Roughly $922 million of general funds compared to about $452 for fiscal 2022. And keep in fiscal 2022, this is when we began to see significant use of the state's general fund balance, which significantly enhanced the fiscal 2022 number. So it's about $470 million above fiscal 2022 and about $850 million above what the baseline estimate for fiscal 2023 would have been. So again, pretty substantial. And significant components of that include 167 for the Washington Metropolitan Transit Administration grants, another $258 million towards the reported $1 billion for school construction, $175 million for various DHCD programs as part of their $430 million capital program, another $100 million for facility renewal, 75 for the Department of General Services, and another 25 for the state parks, and about another 100 million for facility renewal in the University System of Maryland above estimates. Special funds go up about 70 million. The transfer tax formula adds about 110 million above last year's estimate. So the addition is offset by some reductions in the estimates of special fund use in the water quality and drinking water revolving loan programs. And then finally, in federal funds, this goes up 166 million. However, if you offset for the 171 million that the governor has included in the dedicated purpose account for the broadband, statewide broadband initiative, it's roughly about $30 million increase over last year if you control for the differences in the funding for broadband, which again is 171 million in this year's budget. Quickly, in just the state uses to highlight some of the differences in the budget. Again, in state facilities, this goes up about 235 million. Significant components of this are 110 million for facility renewal, again, with 75 million programmed in the dedicated purpose account. Another 63 million for a new veterans home in Baltimore County, roughly 29 million for renovations to 21 Guilford, another 28 million for renovations to the State House and grounds, and about 23.5 million for military installation at Havre de Grace. In the environment area, again, a roughly $123 million increase, supported principally by additional transfer tax, roughly 110 million. As I'd said earlier, this includes $385 million investment through programs that are funded through the program Open Space, another 200 million for water quality and drinking water, about $93 million for Bay Restoration Fund initiatives, $31 million for funding for the Conowingo Dam Watershed Plan. In the area of education, the much reported $1 billion in school construction, again, 480 million of this is estimated built to learn bonds that would be issued. So if you control for that, it's roughly $537 million in education, about 82 million over what was funded in fiscal 2022. Significant enhancements in school construction include $90 million for the Healthy School Initiative compared to 70 million from last year, about 95 million for the supplemental school construction program compared to 75 million last year, and $40 million of new funding to support the revolving loan fund, which was initiated through Built to Learn as well. In higher education, University System of Maryland received about $384 million. About 127 million of that would be dedicated to facility renewal programs through the system statewide, as well as through some direct targeted funding through University System Maryland institutions. And other higher ed receives about $217 million. Again, and about 38 million of that would again go towards facility renewal. So facility renewal is a significant component of the governor's budget. And in housing, again, the $171 million for broadband and roughly about $272 million other housing initiatives, about $42 million above the fiscal 2022 level. And then finally, in local projects, the governor has $184 million in local projects, 123 are considered governor's initiatives, about 25 million of that are items that the legislature had pre-authorized. If you go to page 31, this just gives a summary of kind of where the governor's budget comes in relative to some of the expectations and the recommendations of the Spending Affordability Committee. As David had mentioned earlier, the legislature was looking for about $300 million of unallocated funding for their legislative priorities. The governors come in with $50 million, 25 each for the House and Senate. So that's about $250 million short of what the Spending Affordability Committee expectations were. And again, reaching to facility renewal, higher education, the Spending Affordability Committee was looking for about a $200 million level for facility renewal for higher ed, and it came in at about 136 million in the governor's budget. And then facility renewal for DGS facilities and state parks, the Spending Affordability Committee was looking for about 300 million, and the governor's budget provides about 150 million. So roughly about $465 million under what the Spending Affordability Committee was looking for in those key areas. And unless there are questions, that concludes my portion of the presentation.
And it also concludes our entire presentation. There's a lot of appendices for those of you who have the document that provide additional nitty-gritty detail on various things that we've talked about today. But we're all available to answer any questions if there are any that the committees have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romans and the entire DLS staff for the comprehensive fiscal briefing. Now take questions from members of the Appropriations Committee. Delegate Corman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if this question is for Mr. Romans or Mr. Klein, but I guess I'm a little confused. I've been here 8 years, and every year the capital budget either complies with SAC or CDAC, and oftentimes those are the same number. I don't think the governor's budget complies with either of them, even though there's lots of like in his budget, and even though the governor controls CDAC. So can you just help me understand what's happening here with his numbers?
I think the simplest explanation is the revenue picture continued to improve with the December revenue estimates going up, and they decided that the CDAC limit was unnecessary given the strong revenue picture. But the administration would be, better able to explain their rationale. I will say the only time that I'm aware of that the governor has ever ignored both SAC and CDAC was back in around 2000 when we were having some budget problems. And the CDAC actually reconvened and changed its recommendation to conform with what the governor recommended that year. So this is the first time that I'm aware of that there's just been a change without following having either SAC or CDAC reconvene.
But there's precedent for one of these committees at least to reconvene to keep the process in place. And despite that improving picture, which is great news, the governor still was, I can't remember the exact slide number, but 465 million below the Spending Affordability Committee's goals for capital, Matt?
Yeah, I think in the key areas that the Spending Affordability Committee was looking for when they agreed to the $900 million level that the Capital Debt Affordability Committee had recommended was, in addition to roughly $2 billion of capital investment through the PAYGO program, targeted investment in higher ed and state park and DGS facility renewal, as well as an earmark for the legislature to have some control over the budget overall at 300 million. So he comes in significantly under in many of those, in all three of those areas.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Given our question from another Appropriations Committee member, Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to DLS for the incredibly in-depth presentation as always. I had one quick question and then a longer question about the education piece. Just a quick question. I didn't notice anywhere in the budget. Is there $10 million allocated for the trees program out of the Bay Restoration Fund, or has that not been funded?
I'm going to have to check on that specific element to the program. I'll get back to you specifically on that question.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And then I had just a question. I want to make sure sort of I understand the education piece. It seemed there's a lot of different numbers in here. So on page 6, we've got the underfunding of the blueprint is about 140 million. Then on page 16, the overall lack of funding and the overall lack of funding for the formulas is 285. So is that number come from sort of there's an increase in the compensatory ed, but it doesn't make up for the full hold harmless change? And then obviously the question about just sort of the enrollment numbers, is that the DLS baseline? And obviously we still, it sounds like we don't know what MSDE's baseline and enrollment numbers are.
All right, so there's a lot of questions in there. So I'll start. So the page 6 chart just shows you the elements of Blueprint that were not funded. The big one being that education effort, which is mandated, and then the others which were clearly discretionary. The chart on page 16 is comparing to the DLS forecast when we did spending affordability back in November. And the biggest reason that is, you see a big negative there, is actually because enrollment came in much lower. We had no idea what enrollment would do. So we used our pre-pandemic estimates back in November. Now we have the actual enrollment for the fall, and it was much lower than the pre-pandemic estimate. So that's the big reason why our general fund number is so much lower, or was so much higher than where the budget came in. Now on the forecast, so the administration, and I think this is really DVM, does a budget forecast. They're required to. It appears in the appendices of the budget books. And they make some assumptions, and we do not know what their assumptions in K through 12 are. We asked them to share them because we could see that we were going to be different, and they chose not to.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
Senator Rosapap.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Continue on the same issue of enrollments. My strong impression is from last year, enrollment numbers were down primarily, overwhelmingly among the youngest kids, which kind of makes sense. Is you don't send your kid to pre-K in a pandemic, you don't send your kid to kindergarten, but you don't decide that the kid's never going to go to school or go to a public school. So I'm curious in terms of whether the DLS has put any thinking or modeling into it. It seems not surprising that given the continuation of the COVID crisis, that a bunch of folks are keeping their young kids home from school, but that doesn't change the overall demographics. At some point, a lot of these kids are going to come back to school. Is that something that you either have done or will do for us to take a look at as we look at the budget?
We have done an enrollment forecast out through fiscal 27, and we can certainly share that. We sort of have slow and steady growth throughout the period. It still falls pretty short of where we were estimating back before the pandemic, but it does assume about 1% growth each year as students start to come back, plus the sort of expected growth that was already there.
I'd love to see it, but I also think it's worth thinking about once the pandemic is over, which it will be at some point. I would think that you would have a material bump up at that point, and it's worth modeling that to see if that could be significant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Resnick from the Appropriations Committee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question on staffing, if we can. Obviously, we're seeing a number of salary and bonus enhancements. Can you talk a little bit about how that applies to vacancies? Obviously, we're showing 6,000 plus vacant positions. Do those bonuses, salary increases, or how do they affect vacant PINs and other potential needs that may not be authorized PINs?
Dave, you were going to start, or should I?
No, go ahead.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. The salary actions are broad and widespread, and other than the SLEOLA bargaining unit, are fairly consistent across the rest of the state workforce. So they, like I said, are statewide actions that affect pretty much every state employee.
But that's my question: is do they affect the state employees, or do they affect the positions?
They would affect the positions, right? So new employees coming in would see, especially with the focus on COLAs in recent years, would see the benefits of increased starting salaries.
Okay, great. That's good to see. Thank you very much.
I guess we're left with delegates. Delegate Valentino Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. David, or Mr. Romans, I just had a procedural question. So you talked about a couple $2 billion in federal infrastructure money that's not been dropped down yet into the budget. So in the next 90 days, if the governor doesn't bring that money down, I mean, there's not an obligation to bring it down, is there? Then that's just spent by budget amendment until another budget is produced?
Yeah, basically that's correct. So the governor could choose not, or they may not have the information to put in a supplemental budget in. The easiest thing would be to put a supplemental budget in if they know what they want to do. After session, they could submit budget amendments adding some of the funding. I will note the 2.8 billion is over a 5-year period. So not all of that money, it kind of comes in on an annual basis. So not all of it is available for this year. But yes, the governor would be able to just go ahead and add money in all those different areas by budget amendment without the General Assembly having the ability to block it.
Unless
if you
we
don't
did,
agree with it.
right, unless we did something. So also, how much do you think is available then, or would be available for this budget in available infrastructure money?
I want to say that roughly the money comes in about equal components. So I would say it's 500, 600 million in year one, and then each subsequent year. But it does vary a little bit depending on the funding stream. So we can look at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Romans. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't see any more senators.
I don't either. So
I think
thank you very much.
Mr. Romans, your whole team, great
Yeah.
job as usual.
Great job.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.